Clint Eastwood may have diversified his career beyond the Old West, but his identity has always remained closely tied to the genre that made him a cinematic icon. Ever since he emerged as the man with no name in Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars, 1965, Eastwood's quiet gunslingers became legendary. Despite this association, he made only one Western film in the entire 1980s, but that single entry, Pale Rider, 1985, did more than just revisit familiar territory. It broke a major record and quietly reignited interest in the genre when it had all but died. The Western King Steps Back. Eastwood's 1960s and 70s Western output, highlighted by the Dollars trilogy, High Plains Drifter, and The Outlaw Josey Wales, cemented his status as the Western's most bankable star. But when the 1980s arrived, both Eastwood and Hollywood turned toward lighter, more mainstream fare. Gritty realism and revisionist storytelling took a backseat to flashy blockbusters, sci-fi epics, and broad comedies. The Western, once a studio staple, had become a risky investment. Eastwood mirrored this shift with genre-hopping roles. He starred in offbeat comedies like Any Which Way You Can and Bronco Billy, detective thrillers like Tightrope, and more personal directorial experiments like Honky Tonk Man. Although these projects showed his range, the 1980s were widely seen as his career's weakest era, at least until he returned to familiar territory. Pale Rider, a supernatural Western that brought the genre back from the brink. Released in 1985, Pale Rider stood in stark contrast to the rest of the decade's mainstream cinema. Its tone was somber, mythic, and mysterious. Eastwood's character, known only as the Preacher, rides into a mining town under siege by the corrupt Koila Hood and his hired guns. The story begins with a prayer from a young girl named Megan, begging for help, and the Preacher appears like an avenging spirit, riding in on a pale horse straight out of Revelation. Much like High Plains Drifter, Pale Rider leans heavily into the supernatural, suggesting that the Preacher might be more ghost than man. His past is shrouded in mystery. He's believed to have been killed by the villainous Stockburn, a marshal now employed by La Hood. When Eastwood's Preacher finally confronts his would-be killer and his deputies in a brutal, calculated shootout, it feels less like justice and more like divine retribution. Eastwood's take on Shane is both a homage and an evolution. Where Shane offered ambiguity and sentimentality, Pale Rider delivered haunting ambiguity, righteous vengeance, and gritty realism. The Preacher isn't just a hero, he's a symbol. The biggest Western of the decade, and Eastwood's career at the time. Despite the genre's decline, Pale Rider became the highest-grossing Western of the 1980s and Eastwood's biggest Western box office hit at that point, earning $41 million on a modest budget. That success was particularly meaningful in a decade where most Westerns, like Heaven's Gate and The Legend of the Lone Ranger, were colossal flops. Even 1988's Young Guns, which had a flashier cast and more studio promotion, didn't top Pale Rider in profitability. Eastwood's film returned 6 times its budget, while Young Guns earned 5 times its own. Pale Rider reminded studios that, despite changing tastes, a well-crafted Western could still find a strong audience, especially when Eastwood was at the helm. A quiet career, turning point. Though Eastwood's 1980s films were wildly inconsistent, Pale Rider was a stabilizing moment. While his name was still respected, his box office draw had dimmed. Many of his films during that era, like City Heat and Pink Cadillac, were either commercial misfires or critical disappointments. But Pale Rider proved 2 things. First, that Eastwood could still carry a film with the same steely presence that made him a star, and second, that audiences hadn't given up on Westerns altogether. They just needed the right one. This set the stage for his full career resurgence in the 90s, which culminated with 1992's Unforgiven, a masterful genre deconstruction that won 4 Academy Awards and made nearly $160 million worldwide. Eastwood's legacy and the Western's future. After Pale Rider, studios slowly warmed to the Western again. Films like Young Guns and later Tombstone and Wyatt Earp picked up the torch, but none carried the same mythic gravitas Eastwood brought to his roles. Pale Rider became a blueprint for the modern Western, not sprawling epics like those of the 1960s, but tightly focused, morally complex stories anchored by a magnetic lead. In many ways, Pale Rider was Eastwood's answer to the question Hollywood had stopped asking: can the Western still matter? His answer was a resounding yes. Final ride into legend. Pale Rider was more than just a good Western. It was a resurrection. In a decade that all but buried the genre, Clint Eastwood gave it breath, soul, and a record-breaking hit. While Unforgiven may be the film that won the Oscars, it was Pale Rider that first reminded everyone that Clint Eastwood was, and remains, the last great gunslinger of American cinema.